They're all over the place at the moment. So we have a couple in Sydney, one over in Perth. We have Jeff over in New York at the moment, and Carlos up in Brisbane. So thank you all very much. Just to let you know how we're going to be running today. A bit of housekeeping rules as we go through it all. We're looking at taking for 75 minutes. We're going to be taking questions throughout this sort of panel session. We have, as you can see here, hopefully you can hear now, Kat, I should say. We'll be able to take questions through the go-to session here, but we're going to be using Menti for the first time, and we're going to make it as interactive as possible. And we really want to hear from the audience, what burning questions and thoughts you have, and we're going to try and make it a bit of fun, push our panelists to the limits. So what you have for those who this is the first time, we have a question box here. Take the time, throw your questions in here, and when they pop up, I'll be firing them through to our panelists if relevant. And we're going to be looking at around a solid 20-minute session at the end for open Q&A. So, our panelists today, Anna Sawyer, she's Associate Director at Deloitte. Welcome, Anna.
Thank you, Jerome.
Oh, sorry, Anna, can you speak up a bit? We just lost you there.
Hello. Can you
That's
hear me?
better. I can.
Okay.
And we have Jeff Fieldman, Director at EY. Welcome, Jeff.
Hey, Jerome. Thanks for having me.
We have Kate Stannett, Head Cities of Uber.
Afternoon, everyone. Thanks for having me.
We have Chen Chai from Research Group Manager at CSRO's Data 61. Welcome, Chen.
Hello, guys. Nice meeting you here.
And Carlos Agigo, sorry, Carlos, I hope that's correct. He's a Deloitte partner in Internet of Things up in Brisbane today. Welcome, Carlos. Hello, Carlos. I think you've got your microphone on mute. Hopefully, Carlos will appear any moment now. What we're going to be throwing to our panelists as we go through today is going to be posing some big questions to them. But before we dive into that, I really want to set a bit of a scene onto how things are going at the moment. So data, as you know, it's the new big oil, how data is generated, collected, utilised and growing every day. Joint research by Deloitte, Transport Systems Catapult and Open Data Institute estimate that the opportunity costs of not sharing transport data in the UK alone is £50 billion by 2025. So there's a big incentive for getting out there. When we talk about CAV data, we're speaking about a significant increase in data generation. The growth in data means disruption and new automation, I struggle with that word, and connectivity increases is becoming commonplace in the mobility and transport network. A smart vehicle today has around 100 sensors, and by 2020, this will double. So it's only going to increase the amount of data at the moment. And if you look at this figure here, this is what is created in basically 1 minute on the internet. But just looking at it, there's nothing sitting in here at all around what the connected vehicle is going to be projecting. But when you dive into it, AT&T is just throwing together just some numbers of what this looks like in the future. And this is now. But where is it going to go? So there's 24 million cars in the US at the moment connected, running through AT&T, and you can just see the volume of data that they're creating. So let's pose the big question, what are we going to be seeing as things begin changing and the connected vehicles become a bit more commonplace? As we begin moving towards level 3, level 4 CAVs are projected to become more commonplace, and with them will be an explosion in data. These are vehicles talking to each other on the roads, talking with infrastructure and supporting services. But we need to get that infrastructure in place. So the question really for transport agencies, intelligent mobility built from integrated, efficient, sustainable transport systems offers an enormous opportunity for fixing a range of challenges, we hope, from congestion and inequitable access to public transport, safety and sustainability. So really the key to unlocking these benefits is the free moving of data, we hope, which includes passengers, freight companies, transport operators, policymakers, all those groups coming together and really accessing the data, which is needed for better decision making. So when we hear about data, metadata, personal data, structured, unstructured data, what are the differences? What are the types of data being generated? Chen, what's your thoughts?
I just want to double down what you have shown, Jerome, about the data sets generated from connected and autonomous vehicles. That definitely is a major source for new emerging data sources. But we also have data from other objects, for example, the micro mobility vehicles like shared bikes, scooters, and they generate data, and we experience them as well. Then we also have the infrastructure for the transport systems. That is to include everything, but we can start with like traffic control systems, parking, tunnel, bridge, freeways, and charging stations in the future. They generate a lot of data. And also transport is for people. So people themselves, like travelers, pedestrians, and operators from different organizations, they generate a lot of data and they are consume data. Then freight logistics is a indispensable part of the picture. Then we have IoT enabled and goods parcels, shipments, and so on. These data needs to be and processed as well. So in a broad sense, we would have data from the demand side of the transport system, we have the supply side of the transport system, and also we have the behavior from people. So eventually we want to use the data sets from the three major sources to provide a seamless mobility to travelers and also for operation of logistics.
So it's really going to transform the industry, do you think, the transport industry?
Definitely. So every bit of transport industry is either being transformed or will be transformed.
And I guess this is a perfect segue for you, Kate. Travel data is such an important part of the Uber's business. Do you want to tell us a bit more about the importance of data for a ride-sharing company like yours, like Uber?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think we are essentially a technology and data organization, and it's very much part of our DNA. I think, you know, Uber was started back in 2008 with a pretty simple idea that you could push a button on your phone and a ride will kind of come to your door. And that idea was only really enabled by the fact that new technology and smartphones had been so readily adopted. And, you know, the data that they generate and the connectivity that they allow actually underpins our entire business model. And it certainly wouldn't have been possible without that. So I think this kind of concept of data and connectivity is pretty fundamental for Uber. I mean, if you asked investment analysts, they would probably put a fair bit of the value associated with our company into the data that we hold. But when I think about kind of how we use our data and how important it is, you know, we do 15 million odd trips a day globally. And so we have very rich amounts of data about the way that people move around their cities. And we use that in lots of different ways. You know, it's a source of our innovation and new product developments. I mean, a really obvious example of that is Uber Pool. So when we looked across the billions of trips that are done on our platform, we realized that lots of them are happening at the same time with people going in similar directions. And so from that is born the idea of Uber Pool. So we certainly use data to design our new products and to enhance the user experience. We use it to enhance safety outcomes. So, you know, we have a lot of real-time telematics data that we then use to build safety features like notifications to drivers if they exceed speed limits. We also use data, like we're a heavily data-driven organization, and it's very much in our decision-making culture that we use data to determine, you know, where we're going to launch, what incentives we should offer, how much supply we need. And then the final thing I would say about our data and how important it is that it's actually becoming a really critical component for building trust, both with the community and with governments, and kind of maintaining that social license to operate. And as we move from being a ride sharing company to being a transportation platform, we need to work with policymakers and planners to kind of shape what the future of transport looks like. And all of that requires a level of data sharing and integration that will be kind of critical to success.
Has that been quite a change in thinking for Uber, changing from a transport company to a mobility platform?
Yeah, I think it certainly has. I mean, I think at the beginning, what the core of the idea was about unlocking latency in existing assets. You know, so you have all these cars sitting around, and most of the time, you know, 95% of the time they're idle. Surely we can get more utilization out of what we've got. That was kind of the premise. And I mean, that's still there, but I think now we're thinking much more broadly around, you know, how do you provide people with viable alternatives to private car ownership? And to do that, you need to be able to give them convenient, affordable, safe, reliable options, no matter what their journey might be. So whether it's getting to the train station and then into the city for your commute, or renting a car for a couple of hours on a Saturday morning to do your chores, or, you know, taking an e-scooter through the CBD to have a look at some of the tourist sites, or whatever. That combination of different options will mean that people no longer need to own their own private vehicle.
Excellent. Carlos, in which transport industries do you see benefiting as a result of data generation or insights?
First, a quick check. Can you hear me properly this time?
I can hear you perfectly. Thank you for dialing out and logging back in. Great to have you back.
Excellent, excellent. So the discussion is a multifaceted one in my view. Look, ultimately, I think that the organizations across the industry that use connected and automated vehicle technology to actually optimize the existing product and service portfolio, or even develop new offerings based on data. In my view, those are the ones who are going to leverage this rich data to create new in-vehicle experiences for drivers and passengers. Those will be the ones, in my view, that to create a significant competitive advantage, right, for themselves. If we simplify a little bit the analysis, probably, when I look across that spectrum of use case, my view is that the use case ultimately that leverage CAV data, they will ultimately create opportunities through there's three key value drivers, right? It's improved safety, it's a reduction in cost, and increased revenue. So these industries who kind of focus on these elements will probably have the best positioning, so in terms of organizations. But in my view, the majority of players currently in the ecosystem, they are yet to capture that value, right, of data to realize any of the revenue saved or cost savings. To wrap this up, I think in terms of really like being a bit more specific around the industries, I actually anticipate that incorporating all this data from connected and automated vehicles into smart city solutions, for example, will provide much deeper insight for congestion management, traffic flow optimization, route optimization, transportation system planning. Now it's kind of emerging a lot as well about emissions management, integrated parking. There's a lot of other use cases in that particular segment of industry around the smart cities, but they all aim ultimately at reducing congestion and pollution while increasing safety and the efficiency, right, for the drivers and citizens. Yeah, that's my initial thoughts on that space.
Great answer, I must admit. Chen, do you have anything to add at all?
Yes, in my point of view, I just want to follow up what Kate and Carlos touched about. I think with the new generation of new data in transport industry, we are basically enabling new services like the mobility as a service, and eventually want to move on from what we have now to the future, which is seamless mobility. That is, labeled with connectivity, sharing, electrifying, and powered by autonomous vehicles. And the data and the platforms we have today and the future form is basically going to enable this new service. So either that is help to meet tons of travelers at the time they want to make the trip, and offering the best service to meet their needs, and also improve efficiency while reducing congestion. It's everything in one basket, but the data set and the insight from data and the platform for data management and service provision is essential for this new mobility and service. That's my view for the mobility. Then we also have a important aspect for the infrastructure. What we need the infrastructure to be in the future is the ability to monitor and also running predictive diagnosis with and try to predict, given the current indicators, where the defaults or the failure might be, so we can provide preemptive maintenance to the infrastructure, so the impact of these maintenance or the repairing would be minimized to the operation of transport systems. So these two things will go hand in hand to reinforce each other.
Excellent. So there's a lot of opportunity here. Jeff, I was just wondering, what do you think are the biggest data-driven technology disruptions that you've seen over the last 12 months? And
yeah, so I think it's a really good question, and I think one of the things that we're seeing a convergence of a number of different capabilities, reaching a level of maturity where on-road trials are now starting to operate in congested and open roadways. I think the introduction and maturity around edge computing has been a huge impact on connected and autonomous vehicles, especially in their ability to move through and start to test beyond L2 capabilities, as well as 5G and C-V2X is another domain that I think is really starting to open up that world of CAVs as they become more situationally aware through the increase of both sensors and edge computing, as well as greater comms capability between connected entities, whether it be vehicle to vehicle, pedestrian to vehicle, cyclist to vehicle, and so on and so forth. So I think that those are two of the really major changes or technology disruptions that we've seen over the last 12 months start to hit the ground in and around and impacting CAVs.
Interesting point here from Hamilton. He just raised the point going, what about public transport integration, not just cars and trucks? And for those of you out there, we've got a bit of a word cloud happening at the moment, so we can see what the audience is sort of thinking around what the historic data, what should we aim to fix with new data insights, which is sort of aligning a bit with what our panelists have been talking about. So public transport integration, any thoughts from our panelists? Anna, what's your thoughts?
I think certainly, I think some of the responses that we've seen so far, Kate's talked about personalising transport, so using personal travel data to ensure that individuals are getting and optimising their travel journeys in the most efficient way possible. And from what we've heard from Carlos and Chen, they're certainly on a network level, so trying to tackle some of those really big questions like congestion, which you might also do through public transport. I think just kind of diverting a little bit away from your primary question there, Jerome, and
sorry, Anna, we just got sorry, Anna, we just got some bad feedback. You might just have to try and speak a bit clearer, please.
Oh, okay. Sorry, is that better?
That's better. Try that now.
I was just going to say, if I could divert a little bit away from your primary question about public transport, I think one of the things that we're likely to see in the 1 to 2 years is the connecting of different data sets for peripheral transport services. So say, for example, we want to improve active and public transport use. And one of the best ways that we might be able to do that is to connect, say, data with the kinds of footpaths that people are taking. And so I think outside of transport, what data and data insights and data analysis is being able to tell us is that we can look outside of the road network to try and resolve some of these bigger questions like congestion. Yes, it might be CAVs, and yes, it might be network integration, or it might be network flow through that we're trying to improve, but we could also be doing in other ways that we haven't yet considered. And some of these really untapped opportunities, like Carlos has mentioned.
Right. Thanks, Anna. Kate, just while I was thinking, I've got a question here from John directed to you. So those 23 million connected vehicles you were talking about before, are they directly connected to the cellular networks, or are they connected by a smartphone or a similar device? And what type of data is being collected and by who? Any regulations in place?
Is that a question for me?
That's a question for you indeed, when you were just talking around your 23 million connected vehicles? Oh, actually, no, sorry. That was regards to AT&T. My apologies.
While I've got the microphone, I might just make a comment on the integration of public transport, if I can, because I see that as an absolutely critical piece to providing equitable transport options in our cities. And I think what's been quite exciting in the last 12 months or so is that I think we're making real progress in terms of like the public sector and the private sector working together to share data sets and to integrate different transport options. And the example I've got of this is we recently integrated the Sydney public transport data into the Uber app. It's very new technology. Sydney's the 4th city globally where we've rolled it out. And the reason that that was possible is that the New South Wales government has an open data policy and we're willing to share that with us. So the way the product works is that if you open the Uber app in Sydney and you type in a destination, you will see in your product suite, you'd see UberX, our base product, Uber Pool, and you'll see public transport as an option. And you can then compare the different routes, the time and the cost that it will take you to get to your destination if you use public transport versus any of the other Uber products. And it's definitely the first step towards a fully integrated multimodal journey planning resource. But I think the reality is there are many instances where public transport is the best mode for a journey, but when people are in a hurry, they don't necessarily stop to compare all the options. So if we can give people the information that they need at the time that they're making a decision, we can enable them to make better transport choices for themselves and for the broader city. So I think that public transport integration piece is critical, and there's certainly in Australian governments, there has been a lot of progress in that, I think, over the last 12 months or so.
Excellent. If you look at the work cloud at the moment, safety seems to be the one front and center, congestion, exposure, so road pricing, so productivity. I think public transport sort of sits in a small around the groups, but I think a lot of the stuff you guys have been talking about, we're seeing flowing into what our audience is thinking as well. Do any of you want to comment at all?
I'll jump in here, it's Carlos. Safety is an interesting one, right? If we just split a little bit the topic or the theme, where we have a connected and automated vehicle, when we talk about safety, I think there's two key elements here. There's one, the public and the citizen safety, but the opportunity right now for us as well is more broadly around commercial fleets as well. So there's all these elements of industry that can lead actually that space for us with for example, I was working with some of the large fleets recently here in Australia, and what we were finding is that the drivers actually in that organization, we talk about 1,000 drivers. When you start baselining the data and see how they drive, they're driving pretty badly, right? And these were people who will be bumping in the road, like in each other, and the concept around safety and how once we start connecting these assets, right, to bring these vehicles into an integrated ecosystem, so you start understanding how they move, what they use, who are the drivers, and what they're used for, in a commercial sense as well, you get a perspective of how actually there's so much to do right now in terms of the current technology, even way before I've talked about. Before we get to autonomous vehicles at scale, there's a lot of opportunities to address safety from our company's perspective, right? Organizations, councils, public sector in general, commercial fleets, and so on. Because if you look at, I think the hierarchy of risks, safety driving is the highest risk that we have in Australia from a work-related injury perspective. So even in that simple scenario, like connectivity is key because it gives you access to that data, how people drive, and helps coach people across like dangerous behavior, hours of operations, and so on. Fatigue management is a big one, and there is a lot of good tools out there and data to help us with education, so we can use and help people actually be less fatigued at the wheel. And there's a lot of use cases around that space. Like we've got like emergency services as well. When you're providing services to Australia, to remote locations in Australia, right? People, sometimes you've got a paramedic that drives about 2 hours to go and see a person, and this at the moment, this is all dark data. We just don't know what's going on, and the person could be at the end of the shift. And when you look at that data, there's a lot of opportunities for us actually helping our roads to be safer right now. That's a topic that I'm personally very passionate about. So I'll stop here, but it's a very good one.
Excellent. And I just thought,
hey Jeremy, expanding upon that. So I guess one point that connected vehicles and smart infrastructure is providing around road safety is the ability to get fast positive feedback loops around different advertising campaigns, policy decisions, and on-road campaigns to try to improve road safety. So as an example, in the past, if you put up a billboard, or if you install a new safety barrier, if you have a new sign out there saying sharp curve ahead, it usually takes 7 to 9 years to develop enough crash data to understand if that curve sign has had a statistically significant impact on the road safety of that particular section of road. The use of smart infrastructure and connected vehicles is actually short-circuiting that, where you can actually, and we're working with an agency now, where they're able to determine within 3 weeks if that road safety is actually having a positive effect on driver behavior. So one of the other advantages of connected vehicles is that insight into driver behavior through use of smart infrastructure and connected vehicles to understand if you're actually having a material impact on that driving behavior, or if that sign, if that treatment, if that marketing campaign is ineffective, and then equally feed that back so that the agency can then change the way that they're trying to engage the public, trying to engage the citizens, and trying to engage road users in that particular section of road.
Just building on that briefly, it's such a good point. I think even the mobile phones that most of us have with us all the time now are a really effective way of gathering rich information. Like we get a lot of telematics data through the Uber app, and with if you think about those 15 million trips that happen each day, you can generate a lot of predictive data on where there might be issues in existing infrastructure that needs to be remedied. So we can kind of identify those before anything happens, like simple things like potholes or issues with signage at particular intersections. There's a lot of predictive data that we can get if we engage citizens and use the tech that we've got through smartphones to get on top of some of that and improve road safety outcomes.
Well, we're getting through a few questions flowing in now. What are some of the technological barriers to open data sharing, and that might be also relevant to Australia? Because there's a few people asking around, well, is this actually feasible in a country like Australia?
Happy to jump in here. Yeah. And actually, I'll divert a little bit the question in a way, but I think even before we get to the technology itself for open data, and that in itself deserves a whole webinar, right? So I'll cut short. But it comes down. I'll take a step back. I think it depends on where the player, right, player in that mobility ecosystem sits in the value chain. So if you think about it, like depends whether you are an OEM, like a manufacturer like Ford, GM, Tesla, or you are a supplier. So for instance, you are like a Bridgestone, you supply tires, or you are a dealer, or you are a technology player or a mobility player like Uber and the others. So it really depends, first of all, where you sit in that value chain, because you're going to have your own interests, first of all, for open data, for data sharing. So that's to start off. So, and then from that point onwards, I see two key elements, two answers that haven't been answered in my view in that mobility ecosystem. The first one is clarity on the value proposition that's enabled by mobility data, right? I don't think we are answering that question properly yet. When I talk about properly, it's like with the citizen in mind, not like with our companies or our businesses, at first. So I was saying, because no matter which feature card data can make possible, right? But capturing value from them it's really not feasible if the consumer and citizens don't see the benefit. So far, I personally don't think that all the various players in the mobility ecosystem are doing a great job in communicating the value of data sharing, even before we get to the technology. And the other point is, beyond actually understanding, right, on how these data-enabled features might make my life easier, me as myself as a customer, I must trust that the data that will be shared will be stored and used responsibly to start off. And I think, in general, the consumers, they must be also convinced that the trade-off between sharing personal data and value that's realized, whether it's like was touched before, right, was via consuming ads, premium fees, subscription, whatever channel it is, it's worthwhile relative to the benefit that I get, right, through that feature. So this is the first point. I think clarity on the value proposition. And the second point I think is as important is the collaboration across the mobility ecosystem. So if we look across that spectrum, right, like data-enabled features for vehicles require skills and resources that no single player in the ecosystem they have. And to me, the collaboration will be the key here. So if you look across that spectrum, traditionally the OEMs, for example, they were not the best collaborators in the market at all. And beyond that, the ecosystem players themselves, right, they have varying degrees of readiness for establishing partnerships, which to me is a bad start straight away and does not create a kind of an atmosphere conducive, right, to multilateral collaboration. But however, there's no other option. I think players in that mobility data-enabled market, they will have to develop partnerships throughout the industry and along that value chain centered on data. And unfortunately, the shape of these partnerships, they will vary, right, based on whether they aspire to expand the technology business model in new space, which will create a new attrition. So to me, yeah, that's kind of where I would start the technology conversation, to be honest.
Well, this is a good sort of point. Let's jump
on.
Go, Jeff.
I was gonna say I'm probably a bit skeptical around data sharing, and I think the greatest barrier to it today is every organization feels as though data is the new gold and the most critical part of who they are as a company, and they're always looking to monetize it. And I think that it poses challenges around. You've got public transport and smart infrastructure, and that's usually open data, so that's easily accessible. You've got MaaS services like Uber, who are incredible in the amount of data that they share. But you also have OEMs, and as Carlos mentioned, the biggest challenge that they have is it's not always clear who owns the data. Sometimes it's the actual core manufacturer, Ford, BMW, whoever. Sometimes it's actually the dealership. And I think one of the biggest barriers to this is everybody feels that their own data is their gold, and they're trying to sweat it. And invariably, that means that the openness of that data is usually pretty restricted, either because contractually they don't have the rights to share it, or because there's not an openness because they're looking to monetize it for personal benefits or for the organizational benefits. So I'm probably a bit skeptical when it comes to open data and CAVs right now, just because the operating environment is quite complex and there's a number of different hurdles to work through before that sharing, I think, will really sort of be ubiquitous.
I think, and the workload we have up at the moment is really just looking at something touching on now. So being able to use data about your driving patterns being used for insurance premiums, if we could use them, some of that data to manage congestion. So you can sort of see the attitudes of people sitting there for the willingness to do that. And that's sort of something in the immediate near future, let alone what it's going to be like to get a broader data suite sort of pouring in as well. So it's quite interesting where you can sort of, people are more willing to, they're more comfortable to share around the distraction of mobile phone use, but probably less on speed and cording, which is quite interesting. Anna, any thoughts?
I think I probably am a little more in line with Jeff's views about being skeptical regarding data, particularly if it's personal data. So say on this Menti that we've got here, it was about where you were traveling to. So where are your destinations? Is that something that you would want to share if that was being used for some other purpose like managing congestion? And perhaps people might feel more or less comfortable there. And I think some of the things that we've spoken about as well is about trust. And so how willing are individual consumers and how trusting are they of companies to then not use their data for purposes that are outside of, outside of the areas of consent. So I think at the moment what we're probably seeing is that there is a greater collection of data, with no real sharing of some of the outputs of that data. And I think if we try and hark back to the original definition of what privacy means and why personal or why individuals might want to protect that, privacy really just means that we want to inform, or we want to have control over information relating to us and also access to us. And at the simplest terms, that's what it means. And I guess from a social perspective and a social and historical political perspective, that information about ourselves is being used for both positive and negative gains. And I think if we look at the value of privacy and how we use that on a social level, it is the access to myself that I use to determine the relationships around me. So if we all think about the different groups of people that we know, the only thing that really differentiates those groups apart from the relationship that we have with them, whether it be personal or professional, is that we share information about ourselves. And so if I have a really professional relationship, the level of information that I share with that particular person might be very different to the level of information that I share with someone who is a personal acquaintance. And so if that really is the way that we measure these social relationships, and information about ourselves is the crux of the way that we do it, you can see and understand why people have some mistrust towards companies that haven't then been particularly transparent or accountable, or we don't really trust that that company is going to be able to securely manage our data. And we obviously have some regulations to protect those rights, but we probably all know that the Privacy Act, as an example, is really about protecting personal rights against third-party sharing, and not really about the protection of, say, the information about myself against, say, gossiping or someone breaching my, reading my personal diary, as an example. I think the advent of social media has really blurred those lines, because we are voluntarily sharing a lot of personal information about ourselves, but that has, we know, led to some unintended social consequences. For example, we know that there's a high level of anxiety and depression amongst kids who've grown up with social media, as an example, because perhaps those lines of relationships aren't as clear it was for some of us who grew up before social media. I think that's really, for me, some of the things that we do have to consider when we talk about data sharing and data collection is what are some of the social impacts that can't really be understood at a really qualitative or at a quantitative level.
It's a great point. So I think we'll move on to the next sort of section now. Looking at the open sort of data, and government agencies are really responsible for passenger mobility, typically holds vast amounts of data that have been undervalued, underused. Governments will be under pressure, as we sort of have been speaking about earlier, to really share these data sets. And Corey makes a point here, OEMs and telematics service providers are always very protective over the data, format algorithms, and he sort of makes the point, will we need to develop an international standard for a data format, open source, third parties? Kate, this is something you've been talking about with Transport for New South Wales and open data. Uber looking to offer a public transport platform. What's your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I think the way that this is something that our so the ATG, our Advanced Technology Group, who's working on the self-driving tech for Uber in Pittsburgh in the States. I mean, this is something that they are working on a lot, this idea of standardized formats, so that, all of the data, the language that people are talking around those data is the same, and that they can kind of talk to each other. I mean, one of the big risks, I think, around the sharing and release of data, and that there's privacy concerns, absolutely, if you're doing it not at an aggregate level, but there's also a huge risk of misinterpretation. And this is something that I think, we wrestle with in Uber, when on the one hand, we want to share more and more data because it's not only critical to our strategic sort of objectives around the future of transport, but it's also critical to our social license to operate. So, we want to find ways to be more transparent, but, there's a huge risk of data being misunderstood or misinterpreted or used in a way that it wasn't intended for. And I think you sort of need to mitigate for those risks as well. So that's certainly something that we've been thinking about. And I suppose if you go a little further afield, I don't know if you may have heard what Uber announced recently that we are building a fleet of electric vertical takeoff and landing vehicles, so kind of like flying cars. And there is a whole heap of work that needs to happen in order to bring that to life, around a standardized way of talking about how we regulate and use airspace for this kind of passenger transport, and having that single language will be absolutely critical for success. And that's sort of something that we're working quite closely with CASA on at the moment.
Well, where do we draw the line in collecting data? I mean, your in-cabin cameras existing now, biometric sensors popping up for health. Some of this technology is commonplace already in heavy vehicle sector. It's all based around safety. But are we going to see this flying to the more broader mobility space? And will this be a requirement for level 4? Jeff, Anna, I'd welcome your thoughts.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting question. I think to your question before around insurance and what Kate was just talking about, I think what we'll see is a greater amount of sharing of data from a fleet vehicle and commercial vehicle perspective, including in-cab insights as it relates to driver behavior and fatigue, biometrics and such. Because the vehicle is owned by the company, it's not owned by the individual. So it's kind of like using your laptop at work. Your company, or at least most, sort of understand what websites you're going to and what are you doing to a degree. And I think that's sort of an accepted norm within a fleet vehicle. As that shifts into the residential space, especially in Australia and New Zealand, that was tried. I think it was 2 years ago from an insurance perspective, and it didn't come off pretty well. I reckon that there's a great sense of privacy as it relates to individuals in Australia and New Zealand, and that the adoption of that from a more broad-based CAV perspective, including enabling L4 and L5, is going to be something that's way down the road, at least until from a commercial and fleet vehicle perspective, it's the absolute norm. And then people get used to it during the day, and maybe they're not so put off by it when it comes to using their own vehicle in the evening.
I think just on that as well, when we talk about biometrics and facial recognition sensors and cameras that can do that, and vehicles that might recognize someone on the street, because we've been able to link Microsoft and Google and Apple data with Apple cars that have the same data source. I think the reason why we are distrusting and concerned about these things is because the only institutions that currently monitor us to this degree are institutions that are punitive. And so institutions like corrective services or like prisons, where we do allow this very scrutinized monitoring because we have done something that is against, I guess, the laws that we've all agreed to. And so where does that then blow the line for someone who hasn't done any of those things but is merely going about their business? And perhaps I have an Apple phone, but I don't want my face to be recognized by the Apple car. How do I then give consent or then dissent against such uses? And so I think when we talk about biometrics and facial recognition data, that is personal and private data, and people absolutely have a right to be concerned about drawing a line and agreeing to what are some good and some bad uses of those data sources.
It does. The other thing that came to mind is it does come back to value, right? And so, if 12 years ago, somebody told you that you'd be putting every one of your friends online and every thought you have on a website and taking pictures of food that you eat and putting it on a website, everybody would think you're crazy. But that's the norm because people see value in that in Facebook, right? So I think I'm quite skeptical that this will be adopted, but equally, if there is value and it's perceived not from a insurance premium perspective, because I'm not sure that's tangible for most. If there is a social value or personal value to the user, I could be totally wrong here, and this adoption rate could be accelerated significantly over the next couple of years. but for me, I struggle to understand what that biometrics or personal value could be achieved through the use of biometrics or personal or similar technologies in personal vehicles.
And I think just on that point, Jeff, if I could interject, and about value, and we do now put all of this personal information online, you know, there are swings and roundabouts in that there is growing concern about the amount of information that is now online. Whereas there probably wasn't 5 years ago when everyone was doing it and it was the thing to do. You know, there are an increasing number of execs in Silicon Valley that don't have any social media and don't allow any of their children to have social media accounts. There is also growing evidence that the generation that are growing up with social media have, you know, as I said before, increased rates of anxiety and depression. And so perhaps that might change in the future depending on how much information is out there. I think some of the changes that I've seen in the regulatory space is that there is a growing trend towards tightening some of those data collection avenues.
I think this is
a really good point.
Yeah, I think that's why this is really interesting. That's why I sort of flipped back to this one. This is a point that was made that Anna was kind enough to slide in. Whereas we also know that data output is only as good as the input. And in related cases in the States, COMPASS is a risk assessment algorithm used by the state of Wisconsin, which judges use to the point of sentencing. COMPASS was fed historically recidivism data into the system, and as a result, black defendants are considered a higher risk of recidivism than they actually do, while white defendants are predicted to have a lower rate. So this is sort of a bit of a snip from what's happening in Wisconsin that you can see on the screen at the moment. How do we mitigate these sort of risks when the output is only so good as the input?
I'll jump in here. Can you hear me properly?
Of course we can.
Excellent. One of the things, probably one use case to explore is, we made a comment before around mobile phones helping us around predicting, right, like where there's potholes and behavior and so on. Look, I see a value of that argument. There's a partial agreement in that, but I think alluding to what you just raised, that links back to what Anna said around the value, and people have been seeing us using those technologies as a rod, you know, like on their backs to actually punish people. The reason I'm saying this is because, for example, I've seen organizations, you know, why punishing people by behavior related, like how they're driving, based on phone data. And the accelerometer that's on my iPhone, for example, is by no way of imagination credible, right? Like I can put like in a cup holder which is shaking, or I can have like a properly aftermarket fitted device, right, that sits in a central place that the accelerometer is properly calibrated, where I can identify, for example, if the person is a bad driver in terms of a harsh cornering, harsh braking, and so like that. But I can't trust the data that's really coming from a mobile to tell me whether this person is an amazing driver or not amazing. Of course, again, I'll caveat because there's ways around this predictive algorithms we can apply around, and I agree that you can fill the gaps, but people have been penalized by things like that. And that's the problem. And then you add to that the fact that like GPS, I've seen people being also blamed by the fact that they were running at a certain speed, for example, in a vehicle where they're using only GPS data, which has a high rate of error, right? Unless you actually cross-check that with other types of data sets to be able to really pinpoint that was the real speed versus the speed that was coming through the control module right inside the vehicle. So you need to reconcile that. That's an example. And there was a particular event where that was taken to court, where people were using as against unfair dismissal, right? That they were unfairly dismissed because their behavior that was against the code of conduct and so on, based on data that was inaccurate. So my point is, we got to be careful how we use the technology to penalize people over time and recognize people. So I think there's a lot of regulation that's not my specialty, but needs to be put in place to preserve people's identity and privacy along the way. But more importantly, I would say is really being real. Like if we define that this data is to be used to coach, educate the population, educate people around in the business and so on. Not to penalize. I think that's probably how we're going to get more adoption. the same would apply for usage-based insurance and so on. Like a lot of people were reluctant to actually use it, like pay as you drive or pay how you drive, because a lot of the times they would be afraid of not being a good driver and actually their premium go up. So that's probably like my concern around this space.
Hamilton makes an interesting point here. Totalitarian government could be very cruel with this kind of technology. Now, what's our panelists think?
I can jump in and say
yes,
that is the case. And there's certainly been a number of historical events that support that. I think one of the best ways to control people is through tight monitoring of people's whereabouts, what they do, what they say, where they go, who they see. And so that is a really intangible way of controlling the mass populace. And so I think, yeah, absolutely, yes, it can. But as Carlos said, you know, there are also some serious benefits to having data insights and data insights that we've not had before. And so it is a real trade-off there that I think is a challenge.
My comments on this sort of issue is that in the AI space, we frequently talked about the ethics in the AI, which is another way to say the bad data in, bad output out. So for the general public, especially for the law enforcement as well, is to make sure the way we train these algorithms are well and guided through a very rigorous framework to make sure we're not using skewed and biased data sets to train these algorithms. Otherwise, we would have this bias embedded in them and only reinforces the outcome. So one of the Data 61's mission is to help Australian federal governments and other government agencies to adopt this sort of ethics in AI framework to make sure we have justice in the algorithm as well.
Well, I'm very sorry about Menti playing up on that last slide. Hopefully it'll work on this slide. So I just think what we're going to be knowing is what are the opportunities and benefits that we can really look at, and if we can overcome the barriers, and what's the biggest benefit do you guys think in the panelists with regards to greater data sharing in transport? Jeff, would you like to start?
Yeah, I think some of the greatest barriers to your question are really around trying to break through individual organizations trying to keep data to themselves in a way to monetize it, as well as working through some of the regulatory constructs as it relates to privacy concerns, and is there an inherent consent that you're giving to the bus company or the road agency to collect and monitor where you've been, or does that need to be an explicit consent? I think the other thing too, Jerome, and I don't know the answer to this, so maybe it's a question I'm posing back, is due to GDPR and that being adopted in New Zealand versus Australia taking a slightly different approach to privacy, whether there's a different operating sort of construct that exists as it relates to New Zealand versus Australia, and whether that's also going to be a barrier to how is data going to be shared, how is it going to be normalized, because because our two countries sort of work very collaboratively together, especially in the areas of emerging tech and transport. So it'll be interesting to see how GDPR also has an effect, or if that acts as a bit of a barrier, reducing a bit of collaboration across between Australia and New Zealand.
And if we look at the Menti happening at the moment, I find this quite fascinating when you look at the trust. And obviously, Kate, you think about the growth of Uber, but you then look at the attitudes, but the uncomfortable regards to the data popping up on apps and smart tech. Obviously, this is running to an online profile, but what's your thoughts, Kate?
I mean, I think the private sector organizations have probably not been as careful with personal data in the past than they should have been, and that the Facebook had its own scandal. Like Uber has had issues with data being released, and I think that there is. I understand why people are skeptical about organizations' ability to protect and secure their data. And I mean, it is, even though we've been talking about big data for a number of decades, it is still a capability and a muscle that we're building. And so I think there is a healthy degree of skepticism around what we put in place to control and protect that data. And I think organizations need to be held to account on that. And I mean, there's data, your own personal data and the security around that. There's also, I mean, I know one of the focus areas for our advanced technologies group is thinking about how you actually protect data systems, and thinking particularly about the connected and autonomous vehicles, how you protect those from like cyber attacks, to make sure that the system itself and the integrity of that system is protected. And again, that's something that, there's lots of really smart people around the world working on this kind of stuff, but it's a new skill and a new capability. And I think we have some way to go before we can sort of guarantee the level of security and protection that the community expects.
We've had a lot of the discussion is considered collecting and using and storing data. Are there any comments on the ability to send data? How can vehicles OEMs be authorised to transmit data of the vehicle movements or other people data? A question from James.
I guess,
and I think
this comes. Sorry, you go, Jeff.
Yeah, go ahead.
No, I was going to say this is a really good question, right? Because first of all, I think comes back to the point I was making before around partnerships across that mobility ecosystem. First of all, is like the OEM's interest in that play. If they are looking to maximize their value right across the chain. So say Ford or BMW, for example, with their program that they were launching around BMW fleet, competing with players like Uber and the others, they won't have much interest, to be honest, to be sharing that beyond. So they will want to preserve that. From a privacy perspective, like the consent aspect is a tricky one, because they would need to have ways of subscribing the driver, which currently they tend to keep to themselves into that ecosystem. There was even a lot of fights between enabling Apple Car or what other options, but ultimately that the OEM first of all, it's an OEM's choice, right? Whether they want to play across the value chain or they want to stay only as an OEM player, which most don't want. And there are programs in place at the moment. There's an organization, for example, called Autonomo, that their whole play is to be the broker, right? So they integrate the data across multiple OEMs. There's about 4 to 5 who integrate data with them, and they do that. I wouldn't call this a sanitization, but they actually try to take the data and use the data only for customer benefit. So that's the intent of the program. But it's hard at this stage to say. I think there's a lot of service level agreements that need to be established between all the parties to really answer this question.
Thank you, Carlos.
It also comes down to value, I think. Sorry, Jerome. Because one of the things about it is that if my car sent me an advertisement that there was for a discount at a zoo that was nearby that I was driving past, I'd probably find that a bit creepy at first, but I think that's part of the adoption, right? Is how can you show value to the end consumer, that understanding your personalized movements is actually going to provide value to you and doesn't feel like somebody's just monitoring or watching where you're going at all times. So I think that's going to be one of the real challenges, especially in the near term. And as Anna was talking about before, with some of the pushback into social media and oversharing, I think it's going to be a challenging environment in the next couple of years.
Excellent. What I'll do now is I'm going to put up a rolling question. I think as the point Ron makes here, the last survey really demonstrates the huge task ahead to gain trust on data. So it's going to be interesting. Kate, you mentioned a few times that social license to operate, which has been quite powerful in what you're doing to move forward. But what I'll do now is open this up the questions. So panelists, if you see some questions here that grab you, please let me know which one, and we'll move discussions and open it to you guys now.
I'll go for that first one, the 5G. There is a first question, I think, at top left-hand side around can 5G, something like that. Can you scroll up? I remember seeing that.
It'll come at any moment.
Sorry. I'm just trying to remember the 5G question. Okay, can 5G improve CAV and our networks handle the capture? So my view on this one is first of all, yes, so 5G is essential for CAV success in my view. It needs to fill the gaps that 4G currently. Look, I'm not a telecom specialist by any stretch of imagination, but 4G has a high latency, right? So think of like 60 milliseconds to transmit data. You're not talking about the bandwidth, right, or the channel that you've got, but transmit the data. So with 4G, and between 4G and 5G, in my view, it's basically the difference between a crash and a not crash. If a vehicle, for example, because of latency under 4G, takes longer in milliseconds to respond to a traffic signal or a pedestrian, right, that's walking past that the external sensor did not detect, but you could use the cellular network for 5G to fill that gap, telling you actually there is a pedestrian on your left-hand corner which you haven't seen it, so stop right now. In 5G, the latency is reduced by 10 times, if I'm not wrong. So it's basically the difference between a meter and 1.3 centimeters. So I would say 5G is a must for this going forward.
Excellent. Next one question, panelists. Open data sharing is great in concept, but who will own it? Thoughts?
My experience with the Open Data Hub from Transport for Business Wales is once it's made open and everyone can use it for a lot of purposes, as long as I believe it's not commercially competitive. So in that means once the data is publicized, then users can own it.
Excellent. Anyone else got any other counter thoughts? No?
I reckon that's one of the million-dollar questions that needs to be addressed.
And the other question, will it vary from country to country and even state to state in a country like Australia, do you think?
For retention, you mean?
I think.
For owning. Then there's retention.
Well, the interesting thing about GDPR, and how that trickles through is that if there is a company that has some data around your movements and you ask for that data to be removed, they have an obligation to, as I understand it, remove all the data downstream where that data has propagated. And in New Zealand, that's been adopted. So there will be some functional differences between Australia and New Zealand as it relates to retention of data and ownership of data. And equally, how do you show the lineage of how that data has been moved, how that's been aggregated, anonymized, and used, not just within a single organization, but downstream as well. And I think that's going to be one of the key challenges to data and people movements, potentially, as it relates to fundamental difference between here in Australia and New Zealand.
That was an exact question which just popped up asking that as you spoke about it, Jeff. And there's just a question here from Marie's coming through GoTo. How can we trust companies and governments, etc., will use our data in a way that is not going to disadvantage us? Anna, what's your thoughts?
I think that's a huge challenge. And I think government, when we talk about government, we talk about it as a single entity, but we know that in practice it's probably not, because there are a number of agencies across a number of jurisdictions that all have different codes of conduct, for example. But obviously on top of that, we do have federal and state legislation that then tries to cohesively ensure that the actions are transparent and at least coherent to the community. You know, that's a really tough question and something that I don't have an immediate answer to.
Okay. Anyway, for our panelists, do any of these questions really grab you at the moment? What would you like to sort of discuss?
I was just going to click on that one regarding spying. I think misuse of data is definitely one that probably comes up when we talk about data and cybersecurity. And so if it is open data, how do we ensure that everyone is playing fair and everyone is playing by the rules? And how do we ensure that when that doesn't occur? So there's a really great example. Obviously, there are lots of mapping companies that are currently out there. There are also microsatellite companies that shoot off microsatellites, might be the size of a lunchbox, and they do that every couple of days. And then that gives a scan of, it's kind of like Google Earth, but done more regularly. There's certainly been some concern from, say, defense agencies regarding highly secure sites. And so one of the agreements is that if they do provide those images, which is done on an open platform, that they have to blur out those sites. But once you download that map and it's blurred out, then you can probably very safely infer that that's a secure or that's a high security site. So, you know, we do have to strike that balance. And how do we manage that? And how do we manage users when the data is provided openly and on such a broad basis? And I think that's certainly something that we do have to consider. I'm not sure how, but that's a really good point.
Jeff, you had one you liked.
Oh, there's probably two. So one, somebody asked around what's the, you know, in summary, is there an over-reliance on 4G, 5G, or what about sort of short-range wireless comms like DSRC? And I think that's actually one of the key questions that's working through now, where some OEMs like Cadillac support DSRC natively out of the box, and that's how their vehicles are being equipped, which is great from a peer-to-peer comms perspective. But, you know, and according to different telco reports, is potentially a bit limiting as it relates to C-V2X over 5G. Other vehicles are coming out and are being equipped or plan to be equipped with C-V2X, so sort of 5G spectrum or 4G spectrum supported. And I think that's going to be one of the key challenges equally in tomorrow's world of connected and automated vehicles, as it relates to how do you start to standardize these two broad communication paradigms? And is there going to be a single selection, or is it going to be a heterogeneous or sort of dual operating environment, and therefore smart infrastructure is going to have to support both? Vehicles may support one or the other. How do you ensure safe braking and situational awareness? Those are some of the key questions that need to be resolved as it relates to L4 and L5 or the connected side of tomorrow's vehicles.
And that's good. And a good question here from Marie, just through GoTo again. How can we trust companies and governments, etc., will use our data in a way that's not going to disadvantage us as we move into this new connected vehicle future? From Marie. What's your thoughts, Chen?
I think it's about a balance between what data to give out and then receive service. We can't hold our data without and expecting to be provided with a personalized service. So there is a trade-off. That's one thing. And the second thing is how we can safeguard personal information. So there are a number of technology ways we can do it, making the system more resistant to cyber attack, making it more difficult to re-identify individuals. Like, to identify individuals, we need two data sets, one linked to another. So we can aggregate my own data sets. In a way, I can largely reduce the chances of being re-identified by a third party. And the other element is how to control the access. So when someone, with knowing the actual purpose, is accessing this open data reservoir, how can we control the access in such a way this entity is not able to derive personal information from it? This is also a technological innovation we're pushing at Data 61. So we have seen the early adoption for our data sets in taxation and also in a federal place.
Thanks for that, Chen. Kate, this is a good question. Just wondering about Uber, and you mentioned the data, the enormous volume you collect, and I'm just wondering about in the future, and just drawing on this question here. Do you make the data available to, say, highway patrol or organise like areas where you actually operate Uber vehicles to sort of help provide the safety and reduce risks on the road infrastructure?
I mean, so we do provide a fair amount of aggregated data publicly available through a tool called Movement, which you can Google and have a look at. Not every city around the world's data is ingested into that tool, but there are a number of cities here in Australia that are on it, and certainly in the US. I think there is a huge opportunity for us to use that data. It kind of, I suppose it feeds into the whole kind of smart city narrative. How do we use the data to more effectively align our resources in the places where they're needed, and to improve our infrastructure in the ways that the community wants? And I think there's a lot further that we could go in that regard. I mean, I definitely hear Carlos's point he made earlier around the quality of the data being so critical to that. And I think we will always want to make sure that we have other checks and balances in place to make sure that we're not blindly following data that may have integrity issues. So there's quality assurance processes and things that you need to put in place to make sure that the output that you're getting is what you think you're getting. But if we can work through some of those technological barriers and put some good QA processes in place, then I think there's a huge opportunity to use aggregate data to better inform all sorts of service delivery, far beyond just the transport portfolio.
Wonderful. And I think that big picture sharing collaboration is part of the future. So we're now sort of coming towards the end of our session today. We've had, as you can see, mountains of questions here, lots pouring into go to as well. So I do apologise if I didn't get them all out. We haven't tightened the session down. So thank you very much to our panelists for your time today, and to our listeners. But first, before we end, I'd like to ask each of our panelists one at a time just to give, in 30 seconds, a bit of a take-home message regarding CAV data that you'd like to leave with our listeners. So Anna, we'll start with you first.
Thanks, Jerome. I think the key takeout for me, certainly I've been personally skeptical about data and why some of that data sharing might be a concern. I think the takeout for me is the level of concern that everyone out there has as well, in the face of all of the benefits that we've presented today. And I think going forward, there obviously needs to be greater focus on some of those concerns, because that really is a barrier to technology uptake. And if we don't resolve those, then whatever technology solution that we might have, it really is not going to be accelerated or even adopted. And so if we do want to see these benefits, then we do have to resolve them.
Excellent. Thank you for that, Anna. Jeff, your thoughts?
Yeah, look, I'd say my number one passion and focus in working with transport agencies and CAV organizations is around road safety and the benefits that can be achieved. So from my perspective, I'm equally skeptical around a ubiquitous sort of sharing of data in the future, but I'm hopeful that if we can do so focused on reducing road fatalities at a minimum, that will help start to open up the pathway to the sharing of data between the various organizations that are involved in this in today's sort of MAS environment.
Excellent. Thank you, Jeff. Kate, your thoughts, please.
I mean, I think that yeah, we can use a lot of the data that we have now to kind of answer that question around future value, and I think that's a really important part, because if we define and understand the value, we can have really open pragmatic and informed discussion around where the relative risk trade-off lies. And there is a huge potential. I think there's a lot of benefits, the safety benefits that Jeff was just mentioning, I think are huge. So we want to understand those and then have a really open, frank discussion with members of the entire value chain to make sure that we draw the lines in the right places and manage risk and don't let some of the fears that people have become a reality by moving into things too quickly and not all being on one page about them.
Excellent. So bringing everyone along, fantastic. Chen, your thoughts, please.
My takeaway impression is the bright future is all about people and the system. So for the people, for the travelers, and for the pedestrians, it is about what data to out and expect for the service for them. Then on the system side is how to guarantee cybersecurity and adequate protection about privacy and the limited and malicious access to personal information. So there is no one size for all prescription, but it requires a whole ecosystem to work together and to make this happen.
Thank you very much, Chen. And Carlos, your thoughts, please.
I would split probably in two horizons. So horizon one, which is our now, I'd say it's really bring forward the benefits associated with safety and productivity that the current connectivity in the market can give us. Safety around distracted driving, better driving behavior and so on, helping the population, but also private fleets, right, to increase the safety performance and the productivity around these elements that could be implemented right now around what a lot of people calling the concierge economy, right? So around trunk delivery, for example, packaged, to groceries coming into the trunk of the cars, and on-demand fueling and charging stations, roadside assistance that's proactive and so on. So this is the horizon one. But I think in the horizon two, where we see the rise of the autonomous vehicles, is, for me, the key question is, the key point is making sure that we don't see only rising autonomous vehicles, but we also see what's called ACEs, right? So you have autonomy coming, you have connectivity, you have electrification, and the shared economy coming together. The worst nightmare for us will be being in traffic in a sea of empty cars driving itself along us, right? So I think if we drive this all together, it will be a bright future for us.
Excellent. Thank you very much. And thank you very much to our 5 transformational experts. I think we're very, very lucky to have you, and you're so knowledgeable in this area. It made it very easy. So many questions. Thank you very much to our audience, our listeners, Rachel as well, Goodsell, who helped create the thought leadership paper. And what I'd like to do now is invite you to our next webinar, which we are aiming to have in October, looking around cybersecurity. And thank you all again. I look forward to joining in with you again in the future. Have a lovely day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you all.